People have asked me very often how long I've been playing video games. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but there it is in my first memories, so I typically say all my life. I mean, really, my life didn't begin until I was getting extra lives in video games, am I right? Born with a controller in my hand. Seriously though, while I was just barely old enough to say the word Nintendo, I had the first Nintendo, aka the Nintendo Entertainment System, otherwise known as the NES or NES. I didn't spend much time on the NES, mind you. My first memories of playing Mario Bros. 3 in a house we moved out of when I was 4, so yeah, my mom says I probably shouldn't even remember that house, much less, anything else around it, but I do. I don't totally recall the place perfectly, and the same goes for the NES. I know I played the main Mario platformers, Dr. Mario, Kirby's Adventure on the thing, and a few other games that I'll talk about in a little bit, but that's about all I recall. Regardless, I'm taking a look back on the first Nintendo and seeing how inspirational it was, looking at the type of games it had and some of the history behind it, as well as the legacy it left. That being said, I can't get every detail in a video, so I highly recommend you look some of the stuff up yourself as well. But I'm going to try and keep this video interesting with some facts, some games, and some fun. With that out of the way, join me as we take on the NES. So most of what I know and can see about the NES's history is the American history of the NES and the impact it made here in the States. However, part of this is largely due to the part that Japanese markets kind of never got the NES to begin with. Yeah, rather, the Japanese actually got something called the Famicom. The Family Computer Disk System, or Famicom, was originally a disc-based gaming system using floppy disks until cartridges became popular and cheaper instead. After that, the Famicom had most of the library ported to cartridges, and it's this version that inspired the NES that we got. The NES itself was popular in many countries, but none as influential as the US. Yeah, this is where I could talk about Gaming Crash in detail, but I'll save that for a second. See, the crash didn't affect European markets the same way it did US, and because of this, competition was booming. The NES didn't really make too many waves in the pond versus something like the Sega Master System. And there we have it, the beginning of the biggest video game rivalry in gaming history, Nintendo versus Sega. We'd hear more about it when the Sega Genesis came to the US, but our friends overseas were just getting into it. Of course, there's still many other consoles around in Europe around this time as well, not just Sega. Still, it's fun to note that, heads started butting way back when, right? Here in the States, however, the NES was practically untested. It was difficult to find other consoles selling in the US at this time due to the crash. So how did Nintendo beat the odds? Simple. They made the NES look like some interactive toy. Meet Rob. Rob was introduced to the US with the NES. That's a bit of a tongue twister. US with the NES, US with the NES. To make things look more like a toy than a gaming console, to kind of separate from Atari. Also, an interesting note, toys were separated by boy toys and girl toys. And Nintendo thought it would be easier to advertise to boys in the US market. Ha! Anyway, with Rob's help and the popularity of Mario, the NES hit it big. Eventually, with a great marketing strategy, every kid in America wanted an NES for their own. That being said, part of that was indeed the games themselves. The NES is home to some of the most influential games of all time. Not everything was a home run, however, and I decided to start out with the negative first. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was a game released about 2 months before my very own premiere. It is not liked. The controls are confusing, there are useless attacks, and actions taken in the game, and overall the game is super difficult despite being a rather short experience. Although, playing it now, I seem to be really oddly good at it. That's weird. And, frankly, after playing it, it's not as bad as I once thought it was going to be. Go figure. This is a common theme, though, among a large portion of the NES library. Another game, for example, Dick Tracy, a game that I actually own the original cartridge for, also has some of these issues. It is confusing and incredibly difficult due to a bombardment of enemies shooting at you. This game only has one chance for you to pick up all the clues in a level to find the bad guy and arrest them. But you lose all progress in a level upon death. Hell, let's be honest, I couldn't even figure out how to get out of the damn car. Why were games like this? Well, it's simple. Video rentals. Many video rental locations also allowed video game rentals, and Nintendo and many other developers saw no money for them. While Nintendo discouraged this practice, it didn't try anything until Blockbuster was a thing, to which they tried to sue Blockbuster entirely. It didn't go well for Nintendo, and in the N64 era, it seemed water under the bridge since they had a healthier relationship afterwards. Ironically, a lot of you younger viewers probably won't even know what the hell Blockbuster is, but I digress. Regardless, many developers, especially ones with shorter games, decided to go another way around this situation and take a stand, more or less. What they did was they made their games incredibly difficult. This would hopefully encourage a sale, as children couldn't beat the game over a normal weekend rental. However, some of these games aren't considered to be fun to begin with. This is probably the biggest issue these developers had. However, with also little development time, I'm sure some of these companies didn't lose too much money. It kind of puts the, quality seal of approval, another marketing ploy by Nintendo, into question. Yes, these things are on all officially licensed games because previous consoles just let anyone develop for their console. Nintendo forced stores to only sell approved video games and made that seal to make it look like there wouldn't be as many bad games as there supposedly was on Atari. Oops. Regardless, some games did perfectly well due to being based on other media material. Dick Tracy was one of those. I mean, it sold fairly well. So was Where's Waldo. Yeah, this game wasn't great. The fun of, the Finding Activity book just didn't translate well due to the muddy graphics, not handling the multiple characters on scene very well. I did actually play this back in the day, I believe. I have memories of renting this one. And then there's the LGN games, like Roger Rabbit, another rental of my past. Many movie tie-in games are handled here in the States by this company, and oftentimes they weren't great. They were confusing, difficult, muddled, sometimes didn't even work. While some of these games were produced by known companies like Rare, if it was published by LJN, it was expected to be a rushed mess. Again, another reviewer, yeah, we'll mention him eventually, but doesn't really like this company, that's for sure. This practice with licensed movie games is still a mess today, actually, with many tie-in games being panned critically, all starting with the NES. However, not all games were negative. So while many NES games do have a bit of a negative stigma to them anymore, the NES is the birthplace of many Nintendo characters in their first games. Link, Samus, and Little Mac all come from this console. Many other games got their start here as well. Final Fantasy, Contra, Mega Man, Castlevania, all considered classics of their time. Castlevania is one of the most influential horror games from this console, making things not only about scary monsters like vampires, but making things difficult and taking certain control out of the player's hand. Castlevania is an incredibly difficult game, tying in with that rental business, but unlike many difficult games, the difficulty of Castlevania is considered to be natural. It feels natural, and is also considered to be a fun time regardless of the challenge. Metroid also has elements of sci-fi horror and is based on the Alien franchise of movies. And not unlike a horror game, there's a sense of isolation in Metroid. Biggest difference is Metroid is heavily into exploration, as it is one of the first open world 2D platformers. Yeah, one of the first open 2D world platformers. That's a mouthful. But it was a cool concept. Legend of Zelda took what worked on the Atari adventure games, expanding upon the concepts, and created a huge open world with a top-down camera, bringing fantasy to life. Final Fantasy brought the tabletop fantasy games, like Dungeons & Dragons, and opened them up with a broader market. Contra brought guns into gaming, making a linear adventure out of some arcade-based ideas, redefining a shooter. Mega Man got his less than resounding start on this console, and thankfully he got his real start with the sequel that released, on Mega Man 2. While there are plenty of lower points to many of these games, there are many great classics out there with the NES. Some more point-based, much like the games with Atari and in arcades, but many decided to follow Nintendo's footsteps and start making games with an actual end, a game that had a story to tell. So yes, there were arcade games, but there were also just games that we know them today with storylines. The NES is an important console. It cannot be understated, it cannot be undermined. It is very important to the history of gaming. And that is why a lot of people look at it with a lot of love. But you've probably noticed there's one game in particular that I haven't really talked about a whole lot yet. And that's the game that launched with the damn console. The original Super Mario Brothers! And I'll be taking a deeper look into that next week. Until then, my minions, take care. This is Sauron signing off. Adios. Have a good whatever. Winter break, holidays, you name it. Have a nice time. Take care.